Imagine being trapped 100 feet below the ocean's surface. There's no light, no food, no way out. Just the icy cold grip of the water all around you. You can't see a thing, and your every breath feels like it might be your last. In these moments, most would give up hope, but not Harrison Okene. This is the true story of how one man survived 60 hours trapped underwater. But the most unbelievable part of his story is how he managed to stay alive when all the odds were stacked against him. Meet Harrison Okene, a 29-year-old man, aboard the Jaskin 4, a simple tugboat off the coast of Nigeria. His job? Feeding the crew, keeping the galley clean, prepping meals, and making sure the crew were fed and had enough coffee. He had done this routine a million times. Wake up early, shuffle into the galley, serve up some eggs and toast for the crew, and wait for the day to slowly drag by. His nights, they were for daydreaming, thinking about his family and his faith, and enjoying the quiet rhythm of life on the sea. As he drifted off to sleep, Harrison had no way of knowing that the calm waters above were hiding something sinister below. So, what was lurking beneath the surface, ready to turn Harrison's world upside down? On May 26, 2013, in the early hours of the morning, while Harrison was still sleeping, a sudden, violent wave collided with the tugboat like a sledgehammer, and within moments, the boat began to sink. It's as if Poseidon himself had decided to strike his trident into the ocean and said,
"Let's spice things up, fellows."
He tried to escape, but the water was already too high. Harrison was now fighting to breathe, fighting to survive, with no idea how he could possibly get out. Can you imagine the terror of that moment? How do you survive being trapped in a sinking boat that's sinking deeper every second with no way out? The tugboat eventually, after slowly sinking, came to a sudden stop on the bottom of the ocean floor. It rolls a bit and settles down to its new, forever resting place. Water continues to rush into all areas of the boat, stealing precious air and forcing it upwards to the surface. The creaking and moaning of the boat were deafening, but eventually, it became deadly quiet. Let's be real, no one's ready for something like this. Harrison was no different. In those first few moments, his mind just couldn't accept what was happening. He was trapped in his cabin, water rising fast, and it was easier to think, this can't be real. You know that feeling, right? When something's too terrifying to process, your brain kind of stalls out. The water was ice cold, rising steadily, and he was alone. His first thought, did someone see the boat go down? Would there be a rescue team on the way? Harrison found himself clinging to the slim chance that help was coming. Because who wants to believe they're truly alone in a situation like that? But as time slowly ticked by, the hours became a blur. He couldn't quite figure out how many hours had passed. And as the water kept on rising, reality started to sink in. No one was coming. He was 100 feet at the bottom of the ocean. It was just him, alone in the dark. What do you do when no one's coming and you're running out of air? Now, in most good stories, this is where the mentor shows up. Maybe a wise old fisherman, a talking animal, or, I don't know, Tom Hanks in Castaway. Instead, he found strength in something even more powerful, his faith. With the at the bottom of the ocean and the situation looking hopeless, he turned inward. He prayed. A lot. His faith had always been a steady part of his life, but in that moment, it became his anchor, his guide. He remembered Bible verses he had known for years, and as he floated in a small pocket of air in the boat's bathroom, he repeated them to himself. Somehow, it brought him a kind of clarity. The panic started to ease, and he began to focus on staying alive, one breath at a time. His prayers were simple. Please, my God, just help me survive this. The space he was in was about the size of a small closet. And while that sounds cozy, it's not when it's slowly filling with water. His heart rate was climbing, but he knew he had to keep it under control. Panicking would speed up his breathing, and speeding up his breathing would eat away at the precious air. It became painfully clear. The air in that little bubble wasn't going to last forever. How could he possibly stay alive in a situation that was totally hopeless? "15 to 20 hours had passed, and still no help had arrived. It seemed like forever. Have you ever tried to stay still for hours on end? Not moving, barely breathing? It's a whole different kind of endurance verging on torture. Harrison knew that every breath he took was using up the last bit of air he had. Moving through the boat was impossible. The corridors were flooded and completely dark. He was stuck, totally and completely imprisoned. So here's the thing. Harrison had crossed the line from the guy trapped in a sunken tugboat to Harrison the survivor, and there was no turning back. But the clock was ticking. How much longer could he last before his body and his mind and the air gave out? By this time, maybe 20 hours, maybe 30 hours had passed, and Harrison had gone through an ordeal that most of us would not be able to endure. Let's recap. Harrison was 100 feet down at the bottom of the ocean, in total darkness. The kind of darkness you can't even see your hand in front of you. Just that thought would drive most of us insane. He had no food and no water. Who's ever tried going without food or water for half a day, 1 day, 2 days? Think about what that must be like. We would be more than hangry. We would be the worst version of ourselves. The cold seawater was relentless, gnawing at him, threatening to shut his body down. Have you ever gotten into a shower in the middle of winter, hoping to have a nice hot shower to warm up? You turn on the water and it's icy cold. You immediately move away and try to get the hot water going, or simply jump out of the shower. Now imagine the shower door being locked and the cold tap water not turning off. And to add insult to injury, the lights get switched off and the shower starts to fill with water. This is the stuff of nightmares. Harrison's situation was 100 times worse. The cold was freezing cold. Not room temperature, but freezing cold. And it was slowly creeping up around him, sucking out any heat his body might have had. Another thing Harrison had to endure was the isolation. The silence underwater is a strange, crushing thing. It gets into your head, and when you're alone with your thoughts, it's easy to start believing that maybe, just maybe, no one's going to find you. It's easy to be in a difficult situation when you know help is on its way. It's bearable. But for Harrison, he had no idea that anyone even knew that the boat had sunk. Imagine the thoughts that must have been driving him mad. Would this small room become his tomb? Last but not least was a small reserve of air that was keeping him alive, which he was inadvertently poisoning with every breath he exhaled. Talk about a catch-22 situation. I don't think you could come up with anything more frightening. Still, every second without rescue made survival feel more and more unlikely. The biggest question loomed. Could Harrison keep holding on, even as everything around him told him it was time to let go? What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like this? I know I would not cope. Let me know in the comments if you could handle this situation, or if you would totally go mental or just give up. By now, Harrison had been trapped underwater for 48 hours. At some point, after 2 full days underwater, Harrison had to face something he'd been avoiding. He might not actually make it out alive. The air was getting worse. It wasn't just stale anymore. It was hard to breathe. He was breathing in carbon dioxide. The cold was seeping deeper into his bones. His body was shutting down, and his mind was beginning to fail. He was having to face the darkest, scariest moments of his life. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive. He was fighting the reality that death was closing in. He thought about his wife, his family, the life he had on shore. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure if he was praying or just dreaming. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. His world had shrunk to this tiny air pocket and the distant, impossible hope that someone might find him. Would Harrison's story end here, deep in the ocean, alone in the dark? Or was there still a glimmer of hope? The end was in sight. Harrison had been underwater for nearly 60 hours, and his air was almost completely gone. His breaths were shallow, each one feeling more labored than the last. He could feel his body giving up. His mind drifted further and further away in and out of consciousness. He had been trapped underwater for so long, it's mind-boggling. And now it seemed like the ocean was finally going to win. But then a miracle, faint, almost too distant to believe, Harrison heard something. A sound, something mechanical, like the hum of an engine or machinery. Rescuers? Could it really be? Imagine being in the darkest, quietest place you can imagine, and suddenly hearing the sound of life. It was like music to his ears. But here's the kicker. The divers had no idea Harrison was alive. They were searching for bodies, not survivors. For them, this was a recovery mission, not a rescue. With every ounce of energy he had left, Harrison started making noise, tapping, shouting anything to get their attention. He knew this was his last chance. Would they hear him in time? Or was help coming just a little too late? Harrison saw the divers. His prayers had been answered. So, with the calmness of someone who's been through hell, Harrison slowly reached out and tapped one of the divers on the arm. Now, let me tell you, if you've ever startled someone, you know how funny it can be. But startling a diver in a sunken boat? That's next level. The poor guy probably thought he'd been touched by a ghost. You can imagine the diver's shock. After nearly 60 hours trapped at the bottom of the ocean, against all odds, Harrison was still alive. It was nothing short of a miracle. The flood of emotions that Harrison felt was overwhelming. Relief, exhaustion, disbelief. He burst out crying. He was so relieved. He had survived the impossible. He had held on when everything told him to give up. The diver brought him out of that air pocket, but the danger wasn't over yet. How do you get a man safely to the surface after spending so long under 100 feet of water? Here's where the science kicks in. After spending that much time underwater, Harrison's body was at serious risk of decompression sickness, the bends. You can't just pop up to the surface. The nitrogen that's dissolved in the body's blood and tissues can lead to muscle and joint pain, dizziness, and even death. Not the kind of souvenir you want to take home with you. So, the divers had to be careful. Really careful. They placed him into a diving bell, which was used to maintain the pressure he was at, and very slowly adjusted the pressure until they reached the surface. For Harrison, that slow ascent felt like it took forever. He had survived 60 hours underwater, but now he had to survive the trip back to the world above. His body was weak, his mind exhausted. And even though he was being rescued, there was still the very real possibility that something could go wrong. The question on everyone's mind, including Harrison's, was, would he make it? When Harrison finally broke the surface, it was like being reborn. He was alive, but barely. His body had been through hell. The decompression process wasn't over yet. He spent 3 days in a decompression chamber, slowly allowing his body to adjust. The doctors weren't sure what kind of long-term effects the ordeal might have on him. But one thing was clear. Harrison had done something extraordinary. He had faced death head-on and lived to tell the tale. For the world, Harrison's story was unbelievable. It was the kind of thing that sounded like a movie plot, not real life. But for him, it was all too real. The trauma of what he had been through wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological. He had survived, but what would life be like now that he had? Would the ocean always hold a different kind of weight for him? How do you return to normal life after surviving something like that? Harrison made it back to his normal world, but nothing about it was normal anymore. His story spread, inspiring people all over the world. He had survived something most people wouldn't even imagine, and he brought back with him a message of resilience, faith, and the power of the human spirit. But even though he was a symbol of hope for others, the experience had left its mark on him. It's not something you walk away from unchanged. Despite his amazing ordeal, Harrison did return to the depths of the ocean a few years later. He became a commercial diver, and now diving has become his occupation. He even dives to depths greater than his 100-foot ordeal. He has become one with the ocean that tried to kill him and failed. Hats off to Harrison Okene. If you've enjoyed this story, then you don't want to miss our next epic survival adventure. So hit that notification bell for our following true life survival story. I've also put a link in the description for a PDF that highlights what Harrison could have done to be a little more prepared for his ordeal. Until next time, celebrate your life. It's a great adventure.